The subject this evening is the CIA's role during the early years of the Cold War in defining the troubled relationship between the United States and the Middle East. This is the focus of Hugh Wilford's new book, America's Great Game, and we're delighted to welcome Hugh here this evening, all the way from Long Beach, California, where he is a CSU history professor. Hugh is no stranger to exploring the history of the CIA. His previous book, The Mighty Wurlitzer, How the CIA Played America, examined the relationship between the CIA and various seemingly private U.S. citizen groups that the agency secretly funded. As Hugh says in the preface of his new book, he was surprised to find that relatively little had been written about the agency's operations in the Middle East in the 1940s and 50s. Hugh was able to draw on recently declassified material, as well as extensive interviews and the personal papers of some former CIA operatives and their associates. He centers his book on three of the agency's leading Arabists at that time, Kim and Archie Roosevelt, both grandsons of Teddy Roosevelt, and Miles Copeland, who's quite an interesting, garrulous character. The tale he tells, as a reviewer in the Daily Beast said, is one more of failed good intentions than of imperialistic villainy, a quintessential story of tragic American overreach. And a review in the Boston Globe said Hugh's chronicle of the CIA's adventures and misadventures, quote, makes for compelling, illuminating reading, end quote, that will make you think about how America's profile and influence in the Middle East might have ended up far different. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Hugh Wilford.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, and I'd like to add my thanks to everybody here tonight for coming out in these conditions. If you hadn't already guessed from my accent, I'm originally from England, and I'll be headed back there shortly, so I'm thinking this is perhaps preparation after Southern California for a British winter. Just like to begin by saying a few words about how I came to this subject before describing some of the themes of the book. Now, as you've already heard, my previous book, The Mighty Wurlitzer, was about CIA front groups in the early years of the Cold War. These are apparently private non-government organizations made up of anti-communist private citizens engaged in Cold War propaganda overseas. It later emerged that these groups were in fact being secretly funded and to some extent managed by the CIA. Now, one group I didn't really engage with in the Mighty Wurlitzer was the American Friends of the Middle East. Mainly because its purpose didn't seem to be so much to do with the Cold War as with promoting the Arab world to an American audience, and also it was anti-Zionist, battling the influence of the emerging Israel lobby in 1950s America. And this just seems so sort of odd and unexpected to me. I didn't really quite know what to do with it, so I mentioned it in the Mighty Wurlitzer, but sort of put the American Friends of the Middle East to one side, as it were. After the Mighty Wurlitzer, though, I came back to this story and began sort of delving into it further, and soon realized that the main CIA officer involved in the creation of the American Friends of the Middle East was none other than Kermit Kim Roosevelt. Now, this name might already be familiar to you before this evening, because he is known as the CIA officer who led the 1953 coup operation in Iran that toppled the nationalist government of the Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, and restored the rule of the Shah. And also, as we've just heard, Kim Roosevelt was sort of an American aristocrat. He was a grandson of Theodore Roosevelt and head of the CIA, an early head of the CIA's Middle East division. Thus, his field command of the 1953 coup, which, of course, is a sort of cited as a classic case of blowback, right? It might have averted a Cold War crisis at the time, but it led to later to years of U.S. Iranian hostility. So I guess right away, even before I started out, I had really two questions. First of which was, what was the CIA doing funding this pro-Arab anti-Zionist group? Not perhaps what one would expect the CIA to be doing. And why was Kim Roosevelt the enemy of, or a man known as the enemy of nationalism in Iran? Why was he backing this group, which, among other things, advocated for Arab nationalists like the Egyptian Gamal Nasser? Well, I did a lot of research in government records. Not so much the CIA's own records, because they either remain classified or have been destroyed. But if you sort of snoop around in other record groups, especially those of the State Department, and also go to British public records as well, you can learn a surprising amount of information about CIA operations in this period. Also, collections of private papers and interviews with surviving intelligence officers of the day and family members of my main characters. What emerged from this research was an account of the CIA in the 1940s and 1950s, and this is at the moment really of the birth of the CIA. It comes into existence in 1947, and this is also really the beginning of official U.S. involvement in the Middle East. There's been very little official U.S. presence there prior to this period. So what emerged was this history of the CIA in the Middle East during these crucial decades, but with at its core, Kermit Roosevelt. It's partly a biography of Kermit Roosevelt, but it's a group biography. It also includes Archie Roosevelt, Kermit's cousin, another grandson of TR, and this somewhat colourful, rambunctious personality from a very different background from the aristocratic Roosevelt cousins. Miles Copeland, he's from the South, from Alabama. Compared with the Roosevelts, I guess, from the sort of the wrong side of the tracks, and he later becomes this very sort of indiscreet, garrulous commentator after he's left the agency on intelligence affairs. He's also somewhat improbably the father of Stuart Copeland, drummer for the Police, in case you didn't know that. Now. Together, these three men, Archie and Kermit Roosevelt and Miles Copeland, really helped shape the CIA's early program in the Middle East. And as Kim Roosevelt's involvement in the Iran coup of 1953 perhaps suggests, this involved creating quite a lot of disorder in the Middle East, various attempts at various coup operations and attempts at coups that left a legacy of anti-Americanism that still troubles U.S. relations with the region today. But at the same time, these men were Arabists. That is, they knew a great deal about the Arab world, and they were surprisingly sympathetic towards it, sincerely believed that they had its best interest at heart. So what this book attempts to do is capture this perhaps surprising moment when the CIA was most definitely pro-Arab, and ask where did this impulse come from, this Arabist impulse come from, and where did it go? Why did it eventually become eclipsed by other impulses in U.S. foreign policy? Well, just to sort of sketch the answers to these questions which emerge from my research. First, as to where this Arabism originated, well, to some extent it came from the British, who were, of course, the dominant Western power in the Middle East prior to the US's entry into the region in the early years of the Cold War. The Roosevelt cousins in particular were captivated by the example of earlier British Arabists, in particular T.E. Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia. They both they both grew up reading his account of his involvement in World War One, the Seven Pillars of Wisdom. Kim Roosevelt's father actually knew Lawrence personally and corresponded with him. So they imbibed this sort of tradition of the romantic British attraction towards the Arabs. But this was also where the concept of the Great Game came in. In addition to Lawrence, they read Rudyard Kipling, the bard, the British bard of the British Empire, and the author of Kim, this adventure story about a young Anglo-Indian spy in India, the time of the Raj, which it really shaped Kermit Roosevelt's childhood in particular, his imagination in his childhood, and it's where his nickname of Kim, which stuck with him through his adult life, came from. And I think it's from this British influence that the Roosevelt cousins in particular get this notion of the Middle East, the East generally, the Orient as this sort of place of potential adventure for heroic espionage games. But this isn't the only influence on them. I think it's also important to realized that there was another tradition on which they drew, a distinctively American one, and it was a sort of non-official one. It's the legacy left by a generation of American missionaries in the Middle East. Missionaries had first started going to the Arab world in the early 1800s. Hadn't succeeded in converting many of the non-Christians there to Christianity, but nonetheless they had left this important legacy in the region, founded schools and hospitals, and in particular universities. The American University of Beirut was perhaps the most important American institution in the Arab world prior to the 1940s and 1950s. And it was a creation of these missionaries who identified with Arab nationalism. There was this clear relationship between institutions like American University of Beirut, AUB, and the creation of nationalist ideology in the Arab world. So, in addition to this British imperial tradition, the CIA Arabists are also drawing on this history of American missionary engagement with the Middle East, which is transmitted to the young CIA through a number of people of missionary stock who ran the US's espionage effort in the Middle East during World War II. Characters like William Eddy, and his biographer Thomas Lippman is here tonight. So I think this really is the explanation of the puzzle that I started this research with, which was what was the CIA doing funding an organization like the American Friends of the Middle East. And it also explains this sort of Arabist element within the young CIA, helps explain why it was that Kermit Roosevelt also organized covert backing for Gamal Nasser in Egypt. So at the same time that Kermit Roosevelt is overthrowing the nationalist prime minister of Iran, he is aiding the cause of the Arab nationalist leader of Egypt, a government that was created in the wake of the 1952 Egyptian revolution against a client British monarchy of King Farouk. And Kermit Roosevelt dispatches a CIA team led by Miles Copeland to Cairo. Copeland's cover at this point is that of a Booz Allen Hamilton employee, and that name might be familiar to you because it was also the company employing Edward Snowden at the time of his revelations about NSA surveillance. And the Miles Copeland and Booz Allen Hamilton's involvement in Cairo suggests there's this kind of element of advertising and public relations. American sort of public relations know-how is conveyed to the NASA regime through not just Copeland, but he has a friend, James Eichelberger, whose actual background is with the American advertising company J.W. Thompson. So I call this chapter in my book "Mad Men on the Nile." There's this sort of madmen performing these secret operations in Cairo element to my story at this point. So I won't go into any more detail about the forms that CIA Arabism took. You can read about those in the book. But I do want to say a few words about the decline of CIA Arabism. You know, why it is that the Arabists' pro-Arab, anti-Zionist agenda ultimately failed, because clearly it did. NASA became estranged from the United States and really became quite anti-American. After 1956, the U.S. Throws its weight not so much behind Arab nationalists as behind conservative, sort of British colonial era leaders in the Middle East. Meanwhile, at home, the American Friends of the Middle East, that CIA front group that is advocating on behalf of NASA and the cause of Arab nationalism generally, and attacking American Zionists, suggesting that the U.S. shouldn't be so much behind Israel. AFME and NASA and the U.S. identification with Arab nationalism increasingly gives way to support for conservative regimes and a more pro-Israel foreign policy. The CIA Arabists themselves, as a group, split up by 1958. Kermit Roosevelt has quit the agency. So too has Miles Copeland. They've both gone to the oil industry for somewhat more profitable employment. And Archie Roosevelt, meanwhile, he stays with the CIA, but he is moved to another region. Now, clearly, there were various forces undermining the CIA's Arabist program from the outside. John Foster Dulles, the Secretary of State at the time, takes a strong personal dislike to Gamal Nasser. The British prove very effective at securing American support for their basically anti-nationalist agenda in the in the Middle East, so that the U.S. starts to rally around British client regimes in the region. The conservative Arab leaders themselves also contribute to this move within U.S. foreign policy. But I think that there is also a big internal problem, as it were, with CIA Arabism, and that is that they're so attracted to that tradition of Lawrence and Kipling and the Great Game that they resort too readily, too easy to covert operations in order to address U.S. policy challenges in the Middle East. I think this is particularly true of Kermit Roosevelt, whose nickname Kim conjured up the Great Game, and I think it's, and just to return to that initial sort of conundrum that I started out with. Why is it that Kermit Roosevelt, the friend of Arab nationalism, is working to overthrow a nationalist prime minister in Iran? I think if you study papers and you read his memoir of this event, it's clear that the Cold War, U.S. coveting of Iranian oil fields, these are important considerations for Kermit Roosevelt, as they were for other Americans involved in the planning of this operation. But for him personally, I think what really caused him to run this operation and see it through to the end was this desire to play spy games, to sort of act in the tradition of Lawrence and the hero of the novel that had inspired his nickname. His Kermit Roosevelt's memoir of the 1953 operation, Counter Coup, which was published rather unfortunately in 1979, the year, of course, of the Iranian Revolution. Kermit Roosevelt's memoir reads it almost like an old-fashioned British adventure story in the tradition of Kipling or John Buchan in particular. I just read Buchan's Green Mantle before reading Kermit Roosevelt's Counter Coup, and there are all these kind of similarities between the adventure story and this memoir of a real CIA operation. So despite trying to overcome the British imperial legacy in the Middle East by supporting Arab nationalists, Kim Roosevelt ended up by playing an American version of the Great Game. So what are we to do with this now? What lessons, if any, can be drawn from this story of CIA Arabism? Well, I'm an academic and a historian, so I'm a little uncomfortable about reflecting on current affairs, try to avoid the historical sin of presentism. And in any case, I'm not sure that the lessons are that clear. On the one hand, the surprising fact that CIA Arabism existed at all suggests that there's nothing inevitable about conflict between the US and the Arab world. This earlier history of happier relations between Americans and Arabs, flies in the face of those who would argue that there's some sort of inevitable clash of civilizations, but between Americans and Arabs. But on the other hand, and this is something that reviewers have pointed out, it is striking how quickly the CIA Arabists crossed to the other side of the road, as it were, ceased supporting Arab nationalists and started supporting traditional pro-Western conservative regimes in the region. CIA Arabism in the end proved a very slender reed indeed. One thing, though, to conclude does seem clear to me, and that is that this really is a foundational moment in modern U.S. Middle East relations. If you look at all the major news stories in the region today, from Egypt to Syria to Iran, their origins can be traced to this foundational moment when the U.S. established an official presence in the Middle East and when the CIA was created and ran these operations. So in other words, I think if you really want to understand what's going on now, we do have to know about this earlier history. Thanks very much for your attention.
So I have two quick questions. One, in the 40s, the State Department was also full of Arabists. George Marshall, I think, threatened to resign if Truman recognized Israel, or at least he was very unhappy about it. So were these people connected with the State Department people? And my second question is about Suez. Apparently, you talk about that in the book, the British, French, and Israeli expedition to retake the Suez Canal. Were these three involved in that somehow?
Thank you. Those are great questions. Yes, there were links between the CIA Arabist and Arabist in the State Department. Figure of Loy Henderson is important here. There's another man called Edwin Wright, who was a leading State Department Arabist and who coached the young Archie Roosevelt when he first started having assignments in the Middle East. So it's a widespread phenomenon in U.S. governing circles at this point. There are a number of people who believe that the U.S. should really be throwing its weight behind the Arab world rather than behind Israel, and initially opposed the partition of Palestine and then U.S. recognition of Israel. But of course, it's a battle that they lose because the power of the Zionists in American public life is growing, and they're achieving support of congressmen and so on.
And then there's the Holocaust.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, there is growing American popular support as well for the Zionist cause, precisely because of the the devastating impact of the Holocaust. So, it's a phenomenon that embraces both the State Department and the CIA. With regard to Suez, they're not personally involved. That my three Arabists, except that they all claimed later to have received some intimations from British friends of theirs, British spies and MI6, that something was afoot. Of course, it should perhaps have presented the Arabists with a wonderful moment of opportunity. The fact that the US effectively intervenes on behalf of the Arab world and against the British and the French and the Israelis. But by this point already, John Foster Dulles has really become fed up with NASA, and I think the real story, in some ways, I think historians are now starting to see sort of Suez as in a way an aberration. That the sort of the main story is of growing U.S. irritation with and distancing from Arab nationalism, and a sort of rapprochement actually with Britain in the region. So behind the scenes, the British and Americans, despite Suez, are actually starting to grow closer together, and this to a certain extent happens at the espionage level. It's the CIA and the MI6 which kind of start the thaw in British-American relations that then leads to this general the US kind of taking over Britain's imperial burden, as the British certainly saw it in the Middle East in the years after Suez. Thank you for those questions.
You may already have answered this, but among all the personnel in your book, are you saying there's not one that thought there might be a problem of basic values contradiction between Islam and the West? And the reason I say that is because I've studied from 1750 to 1950. There are a number of major figures that did see such a fundamental clash. John Quincy Adams, Alexis de Tocqueville, John Wesley, Hilary Belloc, G.K. Chesterton. So there wasn't a single figure like that in the personnel of the Arabists?
Amongst the Arabists, no, that there is this belief in a need for sort of Christian and Muslim civilizations to move closer together, that the religions and the ways of life share many things in common. It's for some of the older Arabists of missionary stock, like William Eddy, who is perhaps the sort of the founding father of U.S. espionage in the Middle East. He almost has this kind of mystical belief in the links between Islam and Christianity, and he sees himself sort of almost as a kind of a bridge figure between the two civilizations. I think his happiest moment comes when he acts as the interpreter between Franklin Roosevelt and the Saudi King Ibn Saud at the end of World War II. It's in the book, yeah. So, and he's the interpreter because he has Arabic. So I think I'm not sure that the Roosevelt cousins have quite this kind of intense belief in the convergence of Christianity and Islam that somebody like Eddie did, but it's still there, I think, and the American Friends of the Middle East is sort of geared towards trying to generate dialogue and theological conversations as well. Something called the Continuing Committee on Muslim-Christian Cooperation, which the CIA is funding via the American Friends of the Middle East. So this is all sort of prior to ultimately, of course, Islam. It becomes, in the eyes of some U.S. covert operatives, a kind of a weapon of political warfare. Right? Funding Islamist fundamentalists against the Soviet Union, and which leads to a history of blowback, which many of us are familiar today. But for Arabists like Eddie, I think there is this really intense belief in the need for a sort of genuine and mutually reinforcing dialogue between Christians and Muslims.
So you personally aren't familiar with those voices?
Excuse me?
You personally aren't familiar with those voices, what John Quincy Adams said?
Well, no, I'm just saying that amongst the Arabists, the group that I'm describing, they didn't so much subscribe to that view.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi there. A couple questions. Sure. I guess first off, how united would you say the Arabists were? I mean, when you look at how many different movements you had emerging simultaneously, and there was obviously plenty of conflict, internally, just like today. Well, maybe not quite as intensely, but fairly intensely. How united were they? Did you see some examples where there were some real breaks with them within the group? And then I guess just with the two Roosevelt grandsons, maybe asking you to speculate a little, but what would you say would Teddy Roosevelt himself have been on their side, or do you think he might have been more on the I guess you called it the conservative more sort of standard American interests side of the equation? If there's even a way to speculate. I'm just asking.
Sure. I think as regards the possibility of divisions amongst the Arabists, I think that they're fairly concerted in terms of their values and the vision that they have for the Arab world. There are Kermit Roosevelt, of the two Roosevelt cousins, I think, is the more inclined to covert action, and I think Archie Roosevelt was a little bit more cautious, even conservative in his approach. But nonetheless, even he actually in 1956 and 1957 was involved in coup operations to overthrow the government of Syria. So he was sort of trying to repeat the feat that Kermit Roosevelt had performed in 1953. And there was a little bit of personal rivalry between them as well. I think Archie rather fancied himself as the main guy in the US's in the CIA's Middle East division, but that was a role that Kermit eventually acquired. And I think there was a little Miles Copeland's rambunctiousness, I think, occasionally got on Kermit Roosevelt's nerves. But these are sort of personality clashes, I think, rather than anything more substantial. As regards Theodore Roosevelt's likely views in terms of certainly, I mean, he believed that the U.S. should be the Britain's successor in the region, and I suspect he would have I think he would have approved of Kermit Roosevelt's sort of hunger for manly adventure. I think there's a sense in which the 1953 coup operation is sort of Kermit Roosevelt's attempt to sort of have his own sort of story, like his grandfather's Charge Up Kettle Hill or whatever. There is the kind of the ghost of Theodore Roosevelt is always hovering there, I think, with this generation of Roosevelt men. You know, it's a sort of benign presence, but it's also one that's slightly judging, and they feel they can never quite measure up to. So there's this sort of element of psychological drama going on within the Roosevelt family as well.
Right. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
I look forward to reading your book. I wanted to know, are you familiar with King's Counsel? Written by Jack O'Connell?
Yeah, that's a recent publication,
and
isn't it?
Vernon Loeb, published by Norton in 2011. He was station chief in the Middle East in the 60s and into the 70s. And he gives quite an account of the CIA's role in the Middle East during that period. Are you familiar with the book, and are you familiar with that portion of the history of the agency in the Middle East during the 60s and 70s that you'd like to comment on?
Sure. I don't really. It seemed to me when I was actually expecting, when I wrote the book, to take it a little bit further into the 1960s and probably finish with the 1967 war. 1967 was a very significant year for the CIA Arabists, obviously, in the sense that, you know, it's a year which sees the Arab cause sort of routed in the Middle East itself. It's also the year that the CIA funding of these various front groups is revealed in the media. So the American Friends of the Middle East is revealed as a CIA front, which of course is deeply embarrassing to it, and this delights its Zionist enemies. Mm-hmm. So the Arabist cause kind of it really kind of falls apart really in 1967. But I think it's already. That process has really, in a sense, already taken place before then, and 1958 actually emerged sort of really as the true terminus of my narrative, as it were, because that is the year when my three main characters all move away either from the agency or from the Middle East within the Arab world. But I do know, in answer to your original question, I do know that book. It's a fascinating book.
You've read it.
Yes. And Jack O'Connell, actually, I think his presence in Jordan, and that's really what the book is about, right? It's about his function as the sort of CIA's kind of liaison with and an advisor to Hussein of Jordan. It begins at the very end of my story, really, the US and the CIA are kind of changing sides from Arab nationalists to monarchies and governments more traditionally identified with British imperial interests in the region. I'm glad you mentioned it, and thanks for your question.
I just might mention that David Ignatius devoted an entire editorial in the Washington Post to the book and to Jack O'Connell when it was published. So to fill in that gap when you take it to the next step after your book, this is a great book.
Okay, thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
Just curious, and I have to say I haven't read your book.
Sure.
But I read the synopsis and I listened to your speech here. And I'm just thinking that it has to be more geopolitics than anything else. And the use of the term Arabist, you know, it sounds more like this romanticizing of, you know, these young men that wanted to go off on adventures in the Middle East. And that sounds like complete fiction to me. But if you could explain more, or maybe you could give some more evidence of this Arabism, you know, I think it's much more likely that the CIA was being the CIA, and this was something that was going on, and you know, it's a chess game and geopolitics, and we'll do it by getting their funding. You know, the typical stuff.
Yeah. No, I I understand what you're getting at with that question, and clearly, in the sort of the course of a 20 or 25 minute presentation, I could have gone through the sort of the Cold War dimension of it, and the oil, obviously the oil question, and the U.S.'s desire to ensure that the West, still has access to this incredibly important
I'm sure you were
resource,
and I just hadn't heard anything.
Yeah, sure.
Wanted to.
But there does, when I started researching this subject, though, there was this overwhelming evidence of this sort of pro-Arab tendency amongst this first generation of CIA officers in the Middle East. I mean, it's something that Kermit Roosevelt was advocating for before he joined the agency in 1949. He was creating these Arabist citizen groups to advocate for the Arab side and against the partition of Palestine. Even before he was in the agency, he wrote a book in 1948, sort of advancing the Arabist case to the American public, like I guess many. Like previous generations of Roosevelts, he engaged with public life in addition to his career as Secret Service in the CIA. So it was very difficult to sort of not to take account of this evidence when I was writing the book.
And I'm with it. I was just curious as to a little more meat behind it. Why did he have that? Was it just this? He grew up forever reading about Rudyard Kipling and that just seems kind of crazy. But
but it's where people like Kermit Roosevelt sort of got their initial ideas of the Middle East from. It was because there wasn't this tradition of U.S. engagement with the Middle East prior to this period in the same way that there was with the British and the French. It was really only these American missionaries and educators and some oilmen in the Middle East, and they people like Kermit Roosevelt, sort of passed through the hands of these missionaries who were very pro-Arab and working for the Office of Strategic Services, and I didn't really have time to cover that aspect of the story as well. But the CIA's precursor, the Office of Strategic Services, during World War II, its Middle Eastern division was dominated by these people who had this sort of very pro-Arab and outlook on the region and the U.S.'s role there. So that was another influence on these people, those other factors, of course, are immensely important, and ultimately they win the day, right? The Arabists lose the argument, as it were, but nonetheless, it was there at the beginning. It was undeniably there. So okay, thank you.
So I'm curious as to what extent that the Arabists were free agents as opposed to just carrying out the policies of the president and the Secretary of State and the head of the CIA. Yeah. And I guess relatedly, do you define the Arabists as simply those who are anti-Zionist, or were they promoting an agenda which would make the life of the bulk of the Arabs better? Yeah. I mean, did they support the Algerian revolt, or did they support the French?
No, Archie Roosevelt, along with many other Americans in the Middle East during World War II and in North Africa in particular, were really quite anti-French, and I identified with the Arab independence movements in the French-dominated regions of North Africa during World War II. Indeed, Archie Roosevelt was sent home briefly because of his tendency to criticize the French. So, it was really very striking as I was reading his memoirs and also his diary of his involvement during World War II, how profoundly he identified with the cause of Arab nationalism in North Africa, and he befriended various Arab independence leaders like Habib Bourguiba and others during that period. You also asked about how independent these guys were, and I think they initially have a lot of latitude within the CIA, partly because there just isn't that much area expertise about this region in the and they know something about it or claim to know something about it. So they are, you know, they're Alan Dulles is from a kind of similar aristocratic background, the CIA director from 1953, and he is very much inclined to give Kermit Roosevelt his head, as it were, in this field, but then they're sort of gradually sat upon, as it were. John Foster Dulles, Alan's brother, as he becomes increasingly fed up with Nasser and suspicious of Arab nationalism within the context of the Cold War, he very much sort of departs from the Arabist agenda, and I think Kermit Roosevelt, his decision to leave the CIA in early 1958 is partly because Dulles is no longer listening to him. So he's gone from he was wildly successful early in his career, and his success in Iran in 1953 particularly became a sort of a CIA legend, really, as it were. But then things start to sour for him, and he is no longer given the latitude that he originally had. So I think the answer to your question is initially they had a surprising amount of freedom to act on their own, but later on that declined, and that led to their departure.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi.
Hello.
I had a question. You keep referring to them as Arabists. Now, back then in the 50s, did these guys have a sense that the Iranians are not Arabs? They are not.
Yeah.
They're not even Sunnis. In fact, they would be offended if they're called Arabs, probably. And did these guys have that level of sophistication, or did they just lump them all as Middle East Arabs? What's the historical record on that?
It's interesting. They are. Kermit Roosevelt didn't have Arabic, but Archie Roosevelt and Miles Copeland did. They were the three of them were. They knew a great deal about the Arab world, and they were inclined to sympathize with Arabs, but that attitude didn't really seem to extend to Iranians. Archie Roosevelt, before Kim Roosevelt's operation in 1953 that overthrows Mossadegh, he was in Iran in the years after World War II, and at the time of sort of the first real Cold War struggle that takes place in Iran, 1946, 1947, and it's clear from his account of that moment that he doesn't really have the same personal sympathy for Iranians that he does for Arabs. He in fact sees them in sort of kind of rather Orientalist, British, racist terms, and he explicitly writes about this in his memoirs, and I think a similar. So there's already this kind of this sort of element of at the same time as you sympathize with and relate to the Arabs, you don't necessarily feel the same way about Iranians, and that seems to be there as well for Kim Roosevelt in 1953. He's very ready to sort of accept the British analysis of what's going on in Iran, that these are rather kind of weak-minded, hysterical people who will succumb to Soviet influence unless we get in there. I'm not entirely sure why that is. I think it's partly to do with the fact that possibly Iran is more clearly a sort of a battlefield in the early Cold War, just as it had been in the British Soviet Great Game. So perhaps they're more inclined to sort of accept the British view and also see it as a place for sort of great game adventures. But you're right, there is that distinction, and it plays to the advantage of the Arabs, but not those in Iran.
Okay, thank you.
You're most welcome.
Hi. Hi. I'm curious to try to determine, is there any link between the Arabism or the Arabists in the State Department and the chaos that seems to be part of the the attitude that today the State Department has towards the Arab nations. I mean, the situation in Syria is so chaotic as to be laughable, as far as I'm concerned. Can one bring any lessons, or is there any way of linking the Arabists from that time to the present time, or maybe it's too much of a stretch? I'd like to ask the
I
question.
don't think it is at all. As I sort of suggested towards the end of the talk, I think there are these extraordinary sort of continuities and similarities between recent events and what was going on in the 40s and 50s. I mean, the coup in Iran in 1953 is still, of course, talked about in Iran today, and it's still an issue in U.S.-Iranian relations. You could argue, in fact, that the Arabist success in stabilizing the Nasser regime in Egypt leads to the sort of the durability of the. Although this is, of course, making a big leap, but it could partly explain the durability of the military government in Egypt that has just returned to power, and the similarities between events in Syria in the 1950s and more recently, they're really very striking. In particular, it was last summer, I think, when I was reading stories in the newspapers about why isn't the CIA in there running covert operations to overthrow the Assad regime. Exactly the same things were going on in 1956 and 1957, although this wasn't being discussed publicly. But nonetheless, there were these attempts to mobilize Syrian opposition groups to overthrow the then leftist government in Syria, and the CIA just simply lacked the assets within Syria to be able to do that. So
when you say lacked the assets, you mean lacked the manpower and the spy power, perhaps,
yes.
or
Yes.
whatever is needed.
Exactly,
Yeah.
and the links to opposition groups. This was something that Kermit Roosevelt very much made a point of saying repeatedly, which was that you can't bring about regime change unless there is a substantial element of people within the country in question that are willing to go through with it. It can't just be simply brought about by external manipulation, and I guess that it still holds true today. So yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I had a question about the agency of the Arabists you mentioned, as well as 67, and the significance of that. In terms of agency, you sort of say, well, it is kind of surprising when you look at it from today's point of view that the CIA was funding all these, pro-Arab, anti-Zionist entities. But I recall 25 years ago going to the Soviet Union, working in their museum in Moscow, and they had these geopolitical maps, right, from the 40s, 50s, 60s, and the pro-Soviet countries of the world were colored red, and the pro-American ones were colored blue. And what's interesting is that actually sort of the newly created Israel was colored red with the kibbutzim and their socialist ideas and what have you, and the Arab states were actually colored blue. And that doesn't change, I remember, until sort of the late 50s, when everything switches around, right? And then they start looking as Israel sort of an attachment of the United States. Looking at it from that element, the Soviets had a similar sort of take in terms of knowing who they wanted to support during those crucial years which you discuss. So I'm wondering, isn't it more a question of geopolitics and directives rather than the agency of some Arabists that happen to be sort of believers in the great Christian Arabic civilization? And the second question is 67. You say, well, 67 is a turning point. Isn't it more 91? That's the key question. When the Soviet Union collapses, and when it does, the whole prism of looking at the region through this geopolitical lens falls apart, and in the process, the Soviet makes it a more dangerous place because the Soviet Union isn't around anymore to sort of keep its satellite states in check, and so there's no interlocutor who can put the lid on them and prevent crises from escalating out of control. So to what degree is 91 not more important,
also epistemologically for Arabists or people who write on the region than 67.
Well, briefly, you're right about how it's sort of right. It flips the region in terms of Cold War geopolitical calculations. That the Israel is originally seen by many on the American side as more likely to fall into the Soviet camp than the US, and Stalin doesn't really have all that much interest in the Arab countries to begin with. So. But that changes with Stalin's death and Khrushchev coming to power, and he sees the Middle East as up for grabs as the Cold War very much starts to extend into the Third World, and as the Arabists sort of lose the argument, and within the CIA, James Angleton, better known as the chief of counterintelligence, he also runs the Israeli so-called account, which is this growing espionage connection between the CIA and Mossad, and that as the sort of Arab world is lost to the Americans, that increasingly becomes a very important alliance for the US, not just within the Middle East, but elsewhere as well, in Africa, for example. So. And your point about 91 and the end of the Cold War is well taken as well. I mean, I don't mean to argue for the insignificance of geopolitical considerations as compared to this Arabist impulse. I mean, ultimately, it is the geopolitics, perhaps sort of wrongly analysed by the likes of John Foster Dulles, because he has such the sort of binary polar Cold War view of the world. But it is ultimately that wins out over this impulse. But nonetheless, I think its existence is interesting and suggestive. A path not taken. I think it's worth studying that moment to find out why it wasn't.
Okay. I have here in my hands today's Washington Post. I'll read the headline from page A7. Kerry cites progress, admits risk of failure in Mideast. Besides the confusion that's engendered by this kind of headline, have we ever got anything right in the Middle East, the U.S., besides oil? And maybe that means we should just get out of there?
I'll leave that question hanging there, I think.
I might say historically, though, up into, I don't know, even until 1960.
Yeah.
Did we get anything right?
I think that what did the US get right in the Middle East? Well, let's just try and end on a happier note. I hope this doesn't sound frivolous, but there is this earlier history of a welcome, benign presence of the United States in the Middle East. The era which saw the creation of institutions, important institutions like the American University of Beirut. Excuse me?
We educated George Habash, the leader of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. A lot of good stuff.
Yeah. Well, I think it's worth remembering that moment, and I refer anybody here who isn't familiar with the work of Osama Makdisi to a historian of that relationship at Rice University to his work, as it's a really fascinating moment that is less known than it should be. And on that somewhat evasive response, I'll say thank you very much for your questions.